Well, good morning. It is wonderful to be with all of you. Mitchell, thank you for that very gracious introduction. Mitchell and his friend Kieran are dear friends of my wife Molly and I, so it's fun to have him be here. Just as another side note, I just want to express my thanks to the Diocese and in a particular way to Father Declan. I grew up here. 28 years of my life were spent here in the Diocese before going to Indianapolis. So receiving my sacraments and discerning my vocation and getting married and starting a family all happened here. So when I come back, even if it's just for a little brief stint, it's kind of like a part of my heart gets put back in place. So very happy to be with you. So I want to start by turning the clock back just for a second. February 28th, 1983. That seems like a really obscure date to you. But surprisingly, it's actually a historical date in the United States. Because it was on that date in February of 1983 that the television series, the scripted television series finale, with the highest viewership in United States history, aired on that day. Does anybody want to try and guess what the series was? You can just shout, MASH. Yes, that's impressive. You're not old. You're not old. You're experienced. You're not old. But yes, MASH. I mean, you guys are on it. If you were you watching it? Okay. All right. You were one of 106 million Americans who stopped what they were doing, huddled around television sets to watch Goodbye, Farewell, and Amen. That was the last episode of MASH. To put a little bit of context for that, the total population for the United States in 1983 was roughly 234 million, which basically means that almost half of the country stopped to tune in. And again, I was surprised by that because I'm thinking of shows like, The Place Where Everybody Knows Your Name, right? Cheers, Norm and Cliff and all of them. MASH topped it. Or the hilarious show, the sitcom of the 90s, Seinfeld, the show about nothing. The MASH finale topped that. And so I couldn't help but ask myself, why? What was it about that show that captivated the imagination of so many folks? And to be fair, it had humor just like Cheers and Seinfeld, which by the way, those two are ranked numbers 2 and 3. Okay? So when you win at trivia, I need a little bit of credit. Okay? So, but they had humor. MASH had humor like the other two, right? Hawkeye and his pranks and the ridiculous antics of Corporal Klinger, right? Humor there. I think what made it different was that alongside that lightheartedness and humor, there was very real pain and hurt. Because alongside that is bombshells dropping just outside the camp. The images of bloodied and bandaged soldiers being carried in on cots. The experiences depicted on screen of loss. And I think people resonated with that. Which sounds very strange, because I've never been to the front. Right? I've never been in the trenches of war. But people resonated with that snapshot of undiluted, unglossed over friendship and happiness alongside very real hurt and loss. And no, there's no artillery shells dropping outside of my home, our home, thanks be to God. But for anybody who's had the experience of that unforeseen medical diagnosis that you or someone you love received, or if you've experienced tension and conflict in your family that sometimes got so strong that it pulled it apart, marriages, families, or the unexpected loss of somebody that you loved, that nobody could have ever predicted. Those moments are like bombs going off. They shake the very ground on which you stand, and suddenly how you understood yourself and the world in which you live can radically change in an instant. The difficulty, of course, is that, this isn't just something anecdotal. I mean, obviously we incorporated MASH, and that's fun. But it's very real. Anybody who's paying attention to cultural trends, societal trends in the last 10 to 15 years can see this unfold. The U.S. National Survey on Drug Use and Health conducted a study from 2010 to 2020. So they had a study that ran about 10 years, and they were looking at the prevalence of anxiety amongst different parts of the general population, different demographics. Okay? From 2010 to 2020, the prevalence of anxiety for folks aged 18 to 25 saw an increase of 139%. For those who were 26 to 34, it was 103%. And for those 35 to 49, a 52% increase. Staggering. Anybody who's interested in that topic further, I would highly recommend the work of Dr. Jonathan Haidt. He's a social psychologist from NYU, and he explores that topic in detail. Okay, another couple of considerations for us this morning. The work of Dr. Ann Lemke. She's a psychiatrist from Stanford, studying addiction in particular. She shares with us that 25%, 1 in 4 US adults take psychiatric medication on a daily basis. And last little point, as recent as 2022, we saw the highest number of suicides on record ever recorded. So this is the landscape. People in our lives, our family members, our friends, our coworkers, unlike MASH, they don't present to us bandaged or bloodied. Dr. Healy used the term in her talk earlier, the walking wounded. It was actually a term coined around the First World War, and it referred to soldiers that they were wounded and they were in fact in need of medical attention, but they were functional enough where it wasn't emergent. They didn't need immediate care. And this would take on whole new meaning in the area of mental health as well. What originated as shell shock and eventually developed into post-traumatic stress understanding. Someone who intuited this in his bones, somebody who understood this cultural moment very strongly, was Pope Francis. In his first interview after being elected Pope, Pope Francis said the following: "I see clearly that the thing the Church needs most today is the ability to heal wounds. It needs nearness and proximity. I see the Church as a field hospital after battle." The context in which we live is the front. And that's why I'm wanting to share this backdrop with you. You might be sitting there thinking, wow, it's a sunny day. Why is this a rain cloud, right? Like, why are we starting with this heavy stuff? But I share this with you because I think it is vitally important that we understand as much as possible the context in which our Lord is inviting us to evangelize. Dr. Daniel Siegel is a professor of clinical psychiatry from UCLA. He does a lot of work regarding parenting approaches, parenting strategies. He wrote a book entitled The Whole Brain Child. And this is a quote from that text. He says, by understanding a few simple and easy to master basics about how the brain works, you'll be able to better understand your child, respond more effectively to the difficult situation, and build better foundations for social, emotional, and mental health. Okay, clearly today we're not viewing this quote in the lens of parenting. I think it's very applicable to the work of evangelization as well. If we can understand a few simple and easy understandings of how the basics of the brain work, I think that we can better understand, respond more effectively, and build better foundations with the folks in our life. Okay? So I want to do that. I want to spend just a few minutes looking at some of the simple, easy to master basics about how the brain works. This is a neuroanatomy class. There will be no tests, all right? So just stay with me, okay? All right, so first off, whenever we talk about the brain, we treat it as this monolithic thing. It's just like one unit. But the reality is, much like the rest of our body, it's complex, right? There's multiple parts. Because neurons form systems, and systems comprise lobes, and then lobes comprise hemispheres, and we call that the brain, right? So I want to start with the two main parts, the hemispheres. The left and the right. We'll call them the left brain and right brain, okay? The left focuses on language, logic, linear thinking. Dr. Siegel would quip that your left brain just loved the fact that all three of those things started with L. Okay? So that's the left. The right is present more to the emotional, the creative, intuition, nonverbals. So those are the two parts complementarity. Little example. My wonderful wife, Molly, I was chatting with her about the talk, and I was telling her about this part. She's like, yeah, this would be a good example, right? Because sometimes I tend more towards the right brain, right? And she does. She is exquisitely creative, right? Creative, intuitive with myself and with our boys. There can be some emotion going on sometimes. But yeah, to the right. Myself, for a lot of folks who know me, very left-oriented, right? Like logic and the linear, love it. So the two of us coming together kind of support one another. All right, so that's left and the right. The two last parts that I want to explore would be the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system. Okay, for many of you, the prefrontal cortex sounds familiar because it's the last part of the brain to develop. A lot of us realize that usually by the time you're 25 or 26, that's when it's finished developing. That's another factoid. I'm giving you a tremendous trivia arsenal. Again, I want to make sure, credit. Okay, but the prefrontal cortex is all about planning, problem solving, regulating. And then the limbic system, so if the prefrontal cortex is developing later in life, the limbic system's pretty early. That stuff is regulating feeling and fighting and fleeing. If anybody has anybody seen Inside Out? Okay, yeah, so anger and disgust and fear and all those very visceral things they hang out in the limbic system. Okay? So, why am I outlining these four parts at a conference on evangelization? Because I'm convinced that very often our temptation, what we're inclined to do, is to have our starting point for evangelization be very left-brained. Okay? So, what do I mean by that? I can't tell you how many times I hear people say, I'm wary about going into conversations with people about faith because I'm worried I don't know enough. That's a very common thing I hear from people. I don't know enough about the faith. So this conception of, if I just articulate this apologetic point well enough, if I could just define this particular dogma clearly enough, that's going to move the needle. That's going to capture their heart. Now, I want to clarify, I am not for 1 second trying to diminish or denigrate the role of a healthy apologetic understanding of the faith. I think that we are tremendously blessed that our Catholic faith has a grounding and a firm foundation in reason. That's a gift. Prior to pursuing studies in counseling, philosophy was what I studied. All on board. My invitation this morning is not to discredit those things, but to say, do we want that to be the starting point? Because against the backdrop that we just painted a few minutes ago, with those different statistics and that image of the battlefront, if somebody's critically wounded and they're coming to the field hospital, they're coming to you, I don't think that oftentimes what's characterizing their thinking is logic or being particularly linear. They're clinging to hope in the face of despair. They're just trying to make their way and navigate through relationships that are being ravaged and ruptured. So they're very much in the right brain. The fundamental question for us this morning is whether we're willing to meet them there, to encounter them there. The basis for this is we begin to see that evangelization is inherently relational. The basis of it all is, how can you effectively build and tend to relationship in your life? And this isn't just my thought, and this isn't just the conceptualization of Pope Francis. In his first encyclical as Pope, Benedict XVI in Deus Caritas Est said, being Christian is not the result of an ethical choice or a lofty idea, but it is the encounter with an event, a person, which gives life a new horizon and a decisive direction. Evangelization has to have its starting point in relationship. I placed the image of the visitation on the slide because I think it beautifully captures what we're talking about. So, you got to remember the backdrop of the story. Elizabeth, she's been without child for years. And of course, in that culture and at that time, if that were the case, in a lot of ways you were invisible, irrelevant, looked down upon. And we find that Mary intentionally goes to Elizabeth. She goes in haste, quite literally bringing Christ to her. And the greeting, there's something about the greeting that captured Elizabeth. It moved something in Elizabeth, or I guess someone. It's moved. And from that encounter, from feeling fully seen by Mary, Elizabeth begins to speak truth. She begins to name how God is at work in the world. Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb. She saw Mary too. It was a point of connection. And beautifully, Mary's vocation, which was her vocation from the Annunciation to the cross of Christ, the vocation of receptivity, right? From the Annunciation to the cross of Christ, when she received John and all of us as her sons and daughters, she's able to receive these words of Elizabeth, and she's moved so strongly that she gives birth to the beautiful prayer that's prayed every evening in the church, the Magnificat. That's evangelization. There's mutual movement. It wasn't just simply that Mary was bringing something to Elizabeth and kind of imparting something to her, selling her a product. there was something between the two of them. They could meet each other in that emotional place. There's no account of them swapping stories about the angels, right? They're not comparing notes. They're just present with one another. So that emotional space, more than articulation, what's needed is attunement. Attunement. Anybody heard of Dr. John Gottman? You know about? Okay. So he's a renowned researcher, clinical psychologist, does a tremendous amount of work in the area of marital therapy. He would talk about attunement as that sense when you encounter someone where you feel really seen by them. Attunement is the desire and ability to really capture the inner world of another. So we see that very clearly developmentally with parents and their children. There's an attunement, there's an awareness in relationships, friendships, marriages. But here's the thing. To be comfortable encountering people and meeting people in their right brain, if we want to put it that way, the emotions, the nonverbals, the messiness of the front, we need to have made peace with our own. We needed to have sat in our own stuff. Because interior attunement always precedes exterior attunement. I'm describing empathy, basically, right? The reason why I can look at someone and recognize their pain, or recognize their hurt, or their fear, or their emotion, is because at some point I've caught glimpses of that within my very self. I've familiarized myself, I've drawn near to that. And because I've done that interiorly, I am that much more equipped and apt to do that exteriorly. I can recognize it in another and tend to it more effectively. This is the genius behind the Lord's design for the greatest commandment. He didn't just haphazardly put it together. He was very intentional. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. There has to be a clear and wholesome attunement to what's going on in here in order for me to effectively love my neighbor. But we don't like that. We don't like sitting in the stuff. It's uncomfortable, it's messy, the messiness of the front, right? One of the authors that I think speaks really beautifully to this was C.S. Lewis. Are you any C.S. Lewis fans? He is notably author of Mere Christianity, the Screwtape Letters, Four Loves. When you read those texts, they're really polished. He's got a quick wit, brilliant. But he published another book in 1961 titled A Grief Observed. Actually, originally when it went out, it was under a pseudonym. He didn't have his name on it initially. But when you read that book, it's markedly different from all the other ones that he wrote. It's not polished. It's very raw. It's the journals from after his wife died. And so this is what he says in A Grief Observed. Do I hope that if feeling disguises itself as thought, I shall feel less? Aren't all these notes the senseless writhings of a man who won't accept the fact that there's nothing we can do with suffering except to suffer it? Who still thinks there's some device, if only he could find it, which will make pain not be pain. This very, albeit natural, but not really possible effort to push away, to sidestep, to get away from, the realities of hurt that can be part of our life. The problem is that we try to do that because I think we view it as a disqualification. If we have woundedness in our life, if we have brokenness in our life, we deem it as a disqualification, somehow a demarcation against us and how we can effectively bring the gospel to others. And I just don't think that's true. Service will not be perceived as authentic unless it comes from a heart wounded by the suffering about which he speaks. The great illusion of, in this case, evangelization, is to think that man can be led out of the desert by someone who has never been there. The beginning and the end of all evangelization is to give your life for others. When we're not able to enter into our own center and to confront the reality of our own pain, we cannot be present to the pain of others. The work of attuning interiorly to our own stuff, if we're present to it, if we can sit in it, it's not a barrier. It has the capacity to become a real bridge. One of the most important things from this presentation is, Dr. Healy was talking about it in her talk. I was mentioning it earlier with some of the statistics and everything. It's important when we realize we're not simply surrounded by the walking wounded. We are. That's us. And again, that's an asset. That's not a liability. This understanding gives new light and new context to the words of Pope St. Paul VI, who years ago in Evangelii Nuntiandi said, "Modern man listens more to witnesses than to teachers. And if he listens to teachers, it's because they are witnesses." One of the things that I found interesting was they've done some studies and surveys. For counselors who particularly work with folks wrestling with addiction, approximately 50% of those counselors are themselves in recovery. And one of the things that's striking about that is, in my mind, it makes sense, right? Because they've been through that desert. They know the woundedness from the inside out. It's a bridge, it's not a barrier. Why? Because they've confronted it in their own life. And as a result of that, they're able to walk with others and do the same. Why were Peter and Paul cornerstone evangelists of the early church? Because they were perfect? No. Paul blatantly persecuted Christians. Because they were brilliantly smart? No. Peter's constantly putting his foot in his mouth throughout the gospel. There's no indication that he was particularly educated. They were effective evangelists because they were keenly aware of their own brokenness, and more importantly, they were keenly aware of how God worked in that brokenness. Paul receives that understanding from the Lord after he's asking to not have the brokenness repeatedly, take the thorn out of my flesh. And he finally understands, no. My grace is sufficient. My power is made evident in weakness. They understood that. And because of that understanding, they were able to be medics of mercy in this field hospital of the church. And it's the same call and invitation that we share as well. So I want to begin to wind things down with an image that if you came to my office in Indianapolis at Crux and you're in the waiting room, this is hanging on the wall. It's an image. It's the image that is the thread that's running through this entire day. I'm speaking about Emmaus. Because I think Emmaus is a masterclass on everything that we've been talking about. It's a blueprint. The Lord rolls it out for us. So again, let's back it up, a little bit of context. Those two disciples are walking away from Jerusalem. They just had one of those bombshell moments that we were talking about earlier. Their friend that they loved and trusted, and so much of their future was tied in with, was just executed publicly. The ground beneath their feet shook, and suddenly how they saw themselves and their future radically changed. So they're fleeing from that. And Jesus draws near, right? He's drawing near to these walking wounded men. Jesus himself, we know from the other post-resurrection accounts, remained wounded. So here are these three wounded individuals walking together. One of the other striking details, and it's throughout the resurrection accounts, is that the disciples struggle to recognize Jesus. Not just there, but in other ones. And there can be discourse about, maybe it was the resurrected body and like how the glorified body looks. And I'm not a theologian, I won't speak to that. From my lens, when I read that, I'm like, that's really interesting because that's a striking symptom with trauma. It affects people's memory. There's things called dissociative amnesia, right? And so, maybe it's a Catholic both and. I don't know. But they don't recognize Jesus as he approaches. Now, Jesus is just freshly resurrected. If he wanted to, he could have said, hey, the gospel makes note that they're downcast. I'm back. Turn around. We're good to go. But he doesn't do that. He approaches them with curiosity because he's wanting to attune with them. He lived the experiences that he's asking them about. He doesn't need the tutorial or the spark notes of what happened days before. He wants to know it from the inside out, how they experienced it. So attunement is happening. Dr. Siegel, who I referenced earlier, he talks about connect to redirect. Again, I mentioned that he works a lot with parents, right? So if kids are experiencing an emotional episode, approaching them with logic doesn't work. To remind myself of that sometimes. But so he says you need to connect with them where they're at, and then once they know that you see them, they'll walk with you. Then you connect to redirect. What's interesting is that Jesus has this on display. He connects with them, but then, yes, at a certain point, he begins to redirect. Would I suggest calling people fools when you do this? No. There are some things that only the Son of God can pull off. Okay? But there's a clear pivot moment in their conversation when all of a sudden, yes, he sees full sight of their emotion and the intuition and the nonverbals, and then he starts to introduce some logic, right? It says that he went through the scriptures and pointed out what referred to him. The linear element of things started to become clear. But all that only happened after the relational attunement. And part of the reason why Jesus was so capable of doing this, he's capable of doing everything, but these disciples were leaving Jerusalem with fear, with a feeling of abandonment. Jesus could recognize those in them because he himself experienced those very same things just a couple days before. When he's sweating blood in Gethsemane, when he's on the cross feeling abandoned. See, because interior attunement always precedes effective exterior attunement. Jesus recognizes it in them and can tend to it in them because he has done so within himself. So, they're walking along, and the beautiful thing about the passage is that even with the introduction of the challenge, they love having Jesus with them. Because they say, stay with us, stay with us. And eventually, of course, he reveals himself, and they say, we're not our hearts burning. We're not our brains burning, right? We're not our minds burning with all that knowledge. No, we're not our hearts burning as he shared himself with us. And it radically changed the direction of their life. They're going back. And that's our fundamental invitation as well, is to encounter people, to attune to them, first attuning to our own stuff. That's what's going to make us effective evangelists. That's going to help it be a bridge rather than a barrier. Because at the end of the day, whether it's evangelization or frankly, folks, when I'm meeting with them, beneath everything else, I'm convinced that the one fundamental thing that people want to know is, do you see me or not? Everything else can follow after that. The fundamental question that I need answered and I need to know is whether you see me or not. And that's our call, to see people. And when we do that, their hearts will be aflamed, but so will ours. Thank you.